All right. So good evening, everyone. My name is Silas. Welcome to our event tonight in our new event space here upstairs. A few housekeeping notes. Please keep your phones on silent. If you haven't picked a book up yet, you can do so in the back. We have them for sale. We have your pre-order. And if you'd like to buy an audiobook from our partners at Libro.fm, you can do so at the desk in the back as well. We're here tonight to celebrate the release of A History of Burning with our author, Janika Oza, and hopefully in conversation with our moderator, Chaya Bhuvaneswar. Chaya, I'll just introduce her in the hopes that she appears, is a practicing physician. And there she is.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, come on
Is this
up.
still okay?
Yeah.
Okay. One horrible thing happened.
Amazing time.
Did you read?
All right.
Oh, okay. So.
Well, I can introduce you.
Her?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, can she start with a reading?
Yeah.
That'll be great.
Absolutely. All right. So, Chaya is a practicing physician, writer, and Pan-American Robert W. Bingham debut fiction award finalist for her story collection, White Dancing Elephants, which was also selected as a Kirkus Review's Best Debut Fiction and Best Short Story Collection, and appeared on Best of lists in Harper's Bazaar, Elle, Vogue India, and Entertainment Weekly. Her other work has appeared in the New York Times and the Kenyon Review, among many other publications, and is forthcoming in The Sun. She's received fellowships from McDowell, Community of Writers, Swanee Writers Workshop, and Teachers Creative Writing, for Catapult, the Writing Workshops Dallas, and Grub Street Writers. Welcome, Chaya. Janika Oza is the winner of the 2022 O. Henry Prize for Short Fiction, the 2020 Kenyon Review Short Fiction Award, and the 2020 Review Short Fiction Award. She has received support from the Malay Colony, Tin House, Summer and Winter Workshops, VONA, Voices of Our Nation, and One Story Summer Writers Conference. Her stories and essays have appeared in publications such as the Best Small Fictions 2019 Anthology, Catapult, the Adroit Journal, Prairie Schooner, among others. Welcome, Janika. The History of Burning. Yeah. Just introduce the book. Is an epic historical novel full of wondrous complexity that spans continents and a century and reveals how one act of survival can reverberate through generations. In 1898, hereby, a teenage boy looking for work is taken from his village in India to labor for the British on the East African Railway. Far from home, hereby commits a brutal act in the name of survival that will haunt him and his family for years to come. Herby's children are born in Uganda during the waning days of British colonial rule. As the country moves towards independence, his granddaughters, 3 sisters, come of age in a divided nation. Latika is an inspiring journalist who will put everything on the line for what she believes in. Mayuri's ambitions will take her farther away from home than she ever imagined, and the fearless Kia will have to carry the weight of her family's silence and secrets. In 1972, the entire family is forced to flee under Idi Amin's military dictatorship. Herby's grandchildren are now scattered around the world, struggling to find their way back to each other. One day a letter arrives with news that makes each generation question how far they're willing to go and who they're willing to defy to secure their own place in the world. A History of Burning is an unforgettable tour de force, an intimate family saga of complicity and resistance about the stories we share, the ones that remain unspoken, and the eternal search for home. Here to tell us more are Chaya and Janika.
questions, but not too many, so that we give you all a chance to ask Janika questions about this amazing work.
Hi everyone, thank you all for coming. It's so nice to be here. It's so nice to be back in the Boston area. I lived here for 1 year a while ago, so it's really nice to come back. So I'm just going to start reading right from the beginning. No context needed, and this is Pure by 1898. Can you all hear me okay? The last day Pirbai spent in Gujarat was ignited by a sun that could not last. The heat was a dry beast, scorching the fields yellow as Gora hair. He eased himself onto a step by the water's edge, letting his chappals graze the foam. Jamnagar offered him nothing. For as long as he could remember, every day was the same. By foot, or sometimes hitching a ride on the back of a cart, he wandered the streets, pleading for work. Today, the landowner barely raised his eyes, and he knew he was probably one of many boys turned away. "Look around you, Dikro," the man had muttered. "Do you see any rice, any grain? Dry, all dry. Come back after monsoon." When Pirbai pointed to the white buds bursting across a field, the man laughed until he coughed. His lips cracked and blood pulsed on his stained teeth. Those are for British exports, not for us. That morning, Pirbai had watched his ma ask the gods for forgiveness, praying over his middle sister, whose bones clacked as though loose inside her skin. For days, her body had expelled water, sweat water, wee-wee water, chi water, and now she was limp and dry as the crops outside. When his ma had turned to him and told him to try Jamnagar today, that a neighbor's son had found work there last week, Pirbai had imagined saying no. He had thought about rolling over on his sleeping mat, refusing to leave home and playing gilli danda with his siblings in the deadened grass instead. They would fight over who got to be striker and who fielder, and as the eldest, Pirbai would get first pick. He would strike the gilli all the way to the sea, and his siblings would whistle, Ma looking on in awe. But he was 13, the oldest son, no longer a boy. If he returned bearing nothing again, Ma would suck in her cheeks, then silently scrape her portion onto his plate, a reminder of the strength he would need for tomorrow. Bhai, his mother always called him, brother, reminding him of who he was, to whom he was responsible. The reddening sky warned him to start his journey back, but the wind pulling off the water stilled him. He pressed his palms to his face, the imprint of the sun behind his eyelids a single ember. When he opened his eyes, there was a man, a merchant, his belt buckle polished and skin supple and oiled so that its brown shone almost gold. The man shifted a lump of tobacco in his cheek, exposing teeth like chipped bricks. "Looking for work, Dikro?" Pirbai nodded, eyeing him, too weary from the day to believe. The man opened his fist for a second. It was long enough for Pirbai to spy a pile of coins, grimy but solid, winking in the late afternoon light. "You and I, we were meant to find one another," the man said, and pressed a coin into Pirbai's palm. Pirbai closed his fingers over the skin-warmed metal, unable to resist its unnatural weight. "You have work?" The man pointed out at the water. "I'm looking for boys just like you, young, tough, hardworking. You'll work hard, no?" Now Pirbai focused, aware that this was his chance. He raked a hand through his hair, relieved that he still appeared strong and capable, even as his stomach curled around itself. He smiled to show the man his teeth, that they were straight and square, his best feature, a sign of inner health, his ma always bragged. "I'll work the hardest," he said, and he meant it. The man clapped him on the shoulder and fished into his pocket, drawing out two things. First, a small tin of tobacco, which he flipped open and offered to Pirbai. Tentatively, Pirbai accepted, taking a pinch and dabbing it inside his lip as he'd seen so many men do. Languorous, restless men, hungry-eyed. His heart leapt, knowing that he might no longer be one of them. Beneath the tin of tobacco, the man shook out a long strip of paper. It was crisp and covered in small black etchings. Pirbay's spirit sunk. A test. He had hardly been to school, never learned to read. Now he would have to prove himself smart enough for the job, and he would fail. The man passed him the sheet of paper. He didn't ask Pirbay to read the words, or to recite a poem like the wealthy boys could, or to take up a pen and write. Instead, he produced a small cap of ink and tapped it open, gesturing to the line at the end of the page. "If you want to work, you just need to put your thumbprint here," he said. Marveling at his luck, Pirbay let his right thumb sink into the pool of black, all the way until it hit the bottom. It was nearly dark when they climbed onto the boat. The man hadn't said where they were going, only that Pirbay should wait until nightfall, when they would begin. Briefly, Pirbay imagined his ma worrying where he was, but he had asked a cart driver who was traveling through Porbandar to send word to his family. He pictured the driver calling to his ma from the cart, how his eldest sister would rush to offer him a glass of salted chash for bringing such prosperous news. How proud they would be. The tow was small and wooden, and it creaked as Pirbay and the others slotted themselves into the narrow hull, side by side like sacks of load. Some were boys who looked no older than 10, others fully grown men, bearded, speaking of wives and children. Pirbay recognized them all, though he knew none of them. Like him, they were all thin, dusty, made twitchy from months, perhaps years of searching. The air glimmered with possibility. Pirbay felt a greasy fullness, having bought some batita bhajias with the paisa the merchant gave him, upon the man's insistence that he would need energy for the journey. The oil had curdled on his tongue as he thought of his little sister, who hadn't swallowed food in days, but he forced the thick mash down, sucking away the salt that burned his lips. Now, Pirbay didn't see the merchant. Instead, 3 Goras stepped onto the dhow, their shoulders broad and uniforms crisp. Captains, Pirbay thought, British. The men were speaking, laughing, but the words that tumbled from their lips were unintelligible. He knew only a few words in English, gleaned here and there on his searches for work. Hello, thank you, country, bread, and he heard none of these now. "I heard there's work in Karachi. That's maybe where they're taking us," the boy beside Pirbay said, scratching at a constellation of mosquito bites on his forearm. His name was Jamil, and he had skin like midnight. Pirbay's was more like water-soaked wood. Pirbay's lungs swelled with relief to know he wasn't the only one unaware of their destination. Not that it mattered. By morning he would be working, pocketing rupees to bring home to his ma, enough that they could buy medicine for his sister, maybe even call on a doctor, enough that they could buy milk and load from the shop without having to sweep the floors and clean the toilet pit for a discount, or worse, buying the items on credit that his mother repaid later at night, in secret, though Pirbay had always known. A breeze lifted the hair from his forehead, and he tasted salt as a spray of seawater covered the men like a shroud. As the tow groaned into the water, Pirbay watched the oil lamps on the shore of Gujarat flicker, then fade.
So I think for readers of, so-called South Asian or Indian fiction, it may not be obvious how many things you're doing at the same time, and so adeptly and so gracefully, many different layers, because on the one hand there is this lyricism that is obvious to everyone, and this beautiful sort of limpid prose that's moving, that kind of sinks into your brain, but then just pointing out a few areas where there's a kind of sharp intention that's also making its way into our consciousness. Teeth like bricks, a call back to child labor and indentured servitude in the brick making industry, where children are put into ovens to make bricks because they can fit in the brick kilns. water-soaked wood, the precarity of these voyages by ship, of these indentured servants, and what can happen to the wood. The water like a shroud, and the unknown history, I think largely unknown, unspoken of that. Many South Asian people died in these passages. Many of them died. They were yoked to the ships. They were chained so as not to jump out. They were illiterate. He just has to ink his finger. There's a callback in that scene to, as many of you know, the story of Pinocchio and how he's hoodwinked by the puppeteers to perform as a puppet. That scene very much evoked that for me. This trickery, and this belief of the child who's being tricked. I'm doing something great. I'm getting something great. Oh, this is great, So there's so much going on about the intentionality of your artistry in this lyrical voice that you've constructed that also works as what's called a close third in fiction, right? Meaning that although only at the end of the book there's this chapter in first person, the rest that is in third person still gets us inside the heads of these different characters with this very pure lyrical entry point into. So I'm going to ask you, tell us how you crafted this, because so many things going on, but making it look so graceful, so effortless. It's no wonder that this book got a rave review in the New York Times from S. Kirk Walsh, and I'd recommend reading it because it's a beautifully written review as well.
Thank you, Chaya, for saying all of that. I think part of this is one of those situations where you as the author are not necessarily aware of all of the things that are in your work, all of the references, all of the, there is a lot of intention for sure, but there is also a lot that is, I think, subconscious, and some of those things that you're pointing out, I'm learning anew. So thank you. In terms of crafting this book, so
or process more
yeah.
general, if you want to tell us the general, how did you come to write it? I'm sure
yeah.
people want to know.
So the seed of the book, I guess for me, it started. I was working on an entirely different novel, and I had been working on that for a couple of years, and then I just had this image that popped into my mind. It was a scene, and I saw this family sitting at the kitchen table, and I knew where they were. I knew it was in Kampala. I knew it was 1971. I knew Idi Amin's military coup was happening outside, and the family was kind of like processing that. And that kept, it was very vivid. And so I thought, okay, I'm just gonna jot that down on a sticky note, put it aside, and keep working on this other novel that I'd been working on for 2 years. And when I went and jotted it down, I ended up plotting out the whole novel. And that plot changed a lot because I was working on this for 6 years. But the bones of it were really there in that first note. And it held a feeling of urgency that previous project had never felt. And I think for me that urgency came from the fact that this is stemming from my own family history, and so there was a feeling with that first scene, there was a feeling that I knew this family intimately, I knew who they were intuitively, and at the same time there was so much I didn't know, because there was so much I didn't know about my family history. And so there's that space between knowing and unknowing that felt very alive and very generative, and I wrote into that. And discovering the structure of this book took a long time. It didn't start in close third, it actually started in omniscient third, which I think a lot of my models for writing like a large multi-generational family saga, a lot of those books are written in omniscient third, and so that is how I started writing it. But there was one day where I sat down to write. I had a couple hours on a Saturday, and I wrote an entire chapter, and it just kind of fell out of me. And that's not a normal experience for me, writing a whole chapter in 2 hours, but this one did, and it was Rajni 1947, which is which is a chapter told from the perspective of one of the matriarchs in this family. And that chapter came out in close third. And that was the first chapter that had done that. And I understood something after writing that chapter, which was that I could drop down into the body of this character in a way that I couldn't do with Omniscient, and I could understand so much more deeply what they were going through, and it could be, the writing of this book could be so much more of an embodied experience, and that for me was so powerful that I pivoted and started writing the rest of it that way.
Well, it's an amazing answer, but I think the other thing that you accomplished through that close third is you make us feel. You make us feel through this dropping down into what they're feeling. And I guess a question that sort of piggybacks is, I was struck by, and this was in the New York Times review, but I find specific examples like, there's this passage on page 73. Just yesterday, my neighbor's daughter was taken by armed thugs. When her brother tried to fight the mob off, they stabbed him on the spot in front of his family. She was 14, a pretty chokery, a great difficulty to have daughters at this time. That's one place where you do what I'm going to ask about, and another place of several is where you have people witnessing Uhuru, people witnessing Uhuru and seeing violence that happens suddenly, and a man in office clothes emerging, the soldier slamming the butt of his rifle into the man's body, knocking him backward, and then the reaction of Chaya and Adroa. So in more than one instance, you're able to do that drop down against a backdrop of global events, global political violence that we've heard so much about. We've heard about partition, most of us, right? Something about partition. And thanks to, James McAvoy, we've heard about Idi Amin now, like we meaning, who I mean. And I just wonder, was that a process that you had to work out to sort of reinvent the perspective on these global events through what someone right there was feeling and experiencing? And what did you do to recreate that? How did you do that?
Yeah, I think for me that really comes down to the way that I researched this book, which was initially I was reading whatever I could find in journals, newspapers, articles, whatever. But I quickly realized that there was very little written about this time in history in this particular community, my community, and that's it's not a coincidence that there's very little written about this community, right? It's an erasure of a marginalized community in a way that reading articles about 1972 when Idi Amin had made his expulsion order and had said all Asians have to leave the country in 90 days. And when you read newspaper articles from that time, they make it sound as if it was just this like orderly, like everybody's lining up and they're just, getting their refugee card stamped, and then they, go on to their new home and are, given warm coats and whatever to like bear the weather in London. And when I actually researched through speaking to my family and my community, which was the bulk of the research that I did in order to write this book, and that was a process that took years and years, you realize that that is absolutely not how it was, right? And that is a very specific narrative that has been created, but that is not our truth. And so for me, writing this book was really an intentional rewriting of that narrative. And so those moments that you're bringing up, I think it was very important for me to be kind of bearing witness to what was actually happening for real people. And a lot of that was just coming from the stories that I was hearing, the stories that people were sharing with me, over these long Zoom, WhatsApp, Skype calls that we would have.
So you invited them to come and tell you about these things, including people outside your family or mainly in your family?
Yeah, both. So it started with my family, which was, I think, the greater hurdle, because in my family we didn't really talk about these things, right? We didn't really tell these stories. We didn't tell these stories. I had heard very little about my family's life in Uganda, and so I had to first kind of break that ice. But my family then, they served as these like incredible connectors, and they connected me to more family, and they connected me to more community, and they connected me to people across the world. And so these Zoom Skype calls that I'm referring to, like we would be talking, we would have somebody from Missouri and somebody from Australia and somebody from Vancouver in the same call. And that's because when the expulsion happened, the community was disrupted and dispersed across the world. So our people are everywhere. And so we would be having these calls that were just kind of like these incredible across the world calls. But yeah, and you know, I did have some questions that I would bring to those conversations, but for the most part, it was just a lot of telling stories. There was a lot of it's very self-guided.
Was it easy to get comfortable with being the holder of those stories, you know, because it sounds like there was a momentum, and it sounds like maybe some excitement that you were going to give voice to this history.
Yeah, I think it was both. I think there was the challenge that that a lot of this history is difficult to talk about, and it's very sensitive, and so I was very careful and tried to be very aware of my position. At the same time, I think being in the community, you know, being a descendant of this history allowed for a level of comfort in those conversations. And I just tried to be aware of that. But I do think that that there was kind of this sense of like, oh, if we don't talk about this, but if we don't start talking about it, nobody will know. Nobody will ever know. There are people on the calls who are like, you know, in their 80s. So I think there is that real sense of like, this is gonna die with me, like, let's start. And yeah, last year was the 50th anniversary of the expulsion. And so I think there was like a little bit more attention from just the outside on this history, and I think that was also kind of prompting people to think like, oh yeah, I have a lot to share, right? I have my own stories.
Sorry. Did you also consciously feel any awareness or responsibility about telling a version of this that did not edit out those aspects of which we are ashamed? You know, because I was thinking about Mississippi Masala as an example, right? Cute movie, Sarita Chowdhury, Denzel, a very good-looking couple, you know. But there's no mention of rape of Indian women during the expulsion process. But we know from that conflict, from the military coup in 2000 in Fiji, where ethnic Fijians and Indian descendants of indentured servants had a conflict, Indian women were taken aside and raped. Houses were stoned, people were killed. You know, so, and it's like, you know, like, it's almost like Mississippi Masala was like the Disney version of, you know, like what you, so how did you navigate, and was there any pressure from anyone to sort of hide the dirty bits, you know, because you don't.
Yeah, and that was intentional. I think it does not actually serve us to hide the uncomfortable bits. I think I felt a great sense of responsibility in writing this, in terms of doing justice to this history, doing justice to these stories that were being shared with me, and doing justice to a history that I am descended from, but did not actually live through myself, right? I've never actually lived in Uganda, and so there was a great sense of, often that felt like a burden. But at the same time, that sense of responsibility is also to the truth. And it really doesn't serve us to show, to paint a prettier picture than what actually was. And I think that we also have a responsibility to, like I said before, bear witness and to sit with that discomfort, right? I had to sit with that discomfort in hearing stories that made me uncomfortable, and it was uncomfortable to write certain parts of this book as well. But that only creates a fuller sense of our humanity, and that is what I was trying to do. That is really what my responsibility is too. And in terms of any kind of, being told not to air dirty laundry, I think the key there is I didn't tell people that I was writing a novel. I said I was working on a project. And that it was helpful to say I was working on a project because, there's a great sense of respect for education and academics, and so people were like, oh, I'm interested in this. But I also had to, safeguard some of what I was working on and the kind of, my own creative integrity.
What has the response been like from those communities?
Yeah. Well, I shared the novel with my family, an early copy of the novel, because it felt to me important that at least they would read it or have the chance to read it before it's out. And their response was really positive, which to me is, just so meaningful. And in the book's only been out for 2 weeks, so and it's a big book, it'll take people time if they do choose to read it. There has been a lot of
It reads fast though, it's very propulsive.
Thank you. A lot of people telling me that they really see themselves or their father or their grandfather or their grandmother's story and journey represented in a way that they hadn't experienced, they hadn't seen before. And, there's been a lot of love, and I think that means a lot to me. Every time I hear or get one of these WhatsApp messages, it means a lot to me. But also, I think for me, whether or not my family and community read the book is not actually the point. I think for me, the important part was the process of writing it, and through that process, getting to have these conversations, and that in itself being a kind of opening, a sharing that we hadn't done before, that I hadn't gotten to engage in. And in that process, there was a lot of healing and a lot of love. And so for me, that is really, that speaks more than somebody buying my book now.
But they will buy your book.
They will buy it. Yeah, they will buy it. They may or may not read it.
So I'm just about done with my questions because I really want to have time for everyone else's. I just want to end with a sort of general writerly question of where are you now as a writer? What can we hope to read next from you? And then I think we'll open it up to questions. And bookseller, do you want to come back and call on people when they have questions? Or
Just raise
yeah, excellent. So let's hear about that, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay, well, like I said, the book's been out for 2 weeks, so I hope for a period of rest. And I also think, I think actually in creative work, it's really important to have these kind of fallow periods and just allow new material in. I am working on another novel
Can you tell us anything about it or no?
No.
Well, I will interject that if you read this as I did and you're eager, like where are more words by Janika, she has some nonfiction up on the web, like there's some beautiful personal essays. So if you Google that, do you want to direct them to any of those websites where you have essays or?
Well, you can find it all compiled on my website.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. So questions?
First off, thank you. Sarah says you're awesome, and now I believe her. But so I'm curious, you've chosen to write a novel, a fiction book, and then over the course of interviews with your family and community, it sounds like you learned a lot about that experience. It hasn't really been appropriately documented. Have you thought about also taking those stories without you as the intermediary and sharing them with people?
Yeah, thank you. For me, this was always going to be fiction. And I think there is a difference in what fiction and what nonfiction can do. There is a lot of power in writing just the truth as people say it. But I think what fiction can do is really tap into the emotional truth in a different way. And that, for me, that's always what I wanted to do. The story always came first. And I think through writing this story through fiction, I was able to kind of think about different questions that have played a big part in my own life. I was thinking a lot about, my family they're refugees, but they're also settlers. My family lives in Canada, and we're settlers on stolen land, and we were also refugees. And so what does that mean? What does it mean to be a migrant community in a place that was colonized? What does it mean to be seeking refuge in a place that is also causing harm to other communities? These are questions that have played a role in my life, and fiction kind of allows you to, I don't have answers to the questions, but it allows for a kind of an exploration of these ideas.
Other questions?
Thank you also for sharing this. I was fascinated by what you were saying about how the original inspiration for the story sort of came in this moment when it was going to be a posted note, and then this chapter that suddenly came through in a way that's not even usual for you, and then you found your way to writing in this kind of close third of really connecting to these characters. And you said it was sort of a process of embodiment. I'd be interested if you could say any more just what that was like to actually so live in each of these characters that in a certain sense are maybe part of what you carry, and how that unfolded for you.
Thank you. I think because so much of this was coming from family history, but it was also really coming from a place of curiosity and not knowing. And so I was really driven by a desire to know. And that chapter I was talking about that kind of fell out of me, Rajni, 1947. I think the reason why that fell out of me in that way was because it's a character who's very much inspired by my grandmother. And so I knew her journey. I knew that she had been through partition, that she had to leave her first home and then moved to Uganda and gone through this, the same experience of exile, and leaving community and leaving family and leaving home. And so there was a sense of, there was something there that I knew, something there that had been kind of living in me through my family, through generations of my family, and at the same time there was so much that I didn't know. I never met my grandmother, and so those little bits of information, that's kind of all I had, right? And so there are so many questions my whole life, And so writing this really allowed me to kind of write into those questions and write towards my grandmother, and towards other ancestors who I never got to speak to. There was somebody at an event last week in Ottawa who was actually from the same community as me, in the audience, and came up afterwards and said, this is the kind of book that answers the questions that we didn't get to ask our grandparents.
I have two questions, if that's okay. You talked a little bit about your archival work and then also the interviews that you were able to do. The first question, I'm wondering what else fed you as you were writing this book? What were the other sort of like North Stars or like things that were influencing the creation of the novel? And then the second question is just about language. You're writing in English, but I assume not all the characters are speaking in English. So I'm wondering how translation or how you dealt with the question of language as you were writing the book.
Thank you. Yeah, two amazing questions. The first question, what else I was consuming or being fed by. Well, I was reading a lot, and I was reading very widely, and often when I was like deep in the writing of this book and on deadline, working with editors, it was difficult to also be reading extensively every day. So I was turning to poetry a lot, and sometimes I would just be like a couple poems in the morning before getting to writing, but I found that immensely nourishing. I was also reading a lot of nonfiction that was, related to the world of this book. A book that I think everybody should read. It's by Anchal Malhotra, and it's called, do you know it? Remnants of Partition, I think that's what it's called. It's this huge book, but it's basically this like incredible document where Anchal spoke to survivors of partition who similarly, there's great silence around speaking about very traumatic events. And she's a descendant a couple generations later, and the way that she was able to, create this opening and have these conversations was through objects. And so she would ask people to speak about an object that they were able to bring over when they migrated, and that kind of served as an opening for talking about whatever they wanted to talk about, whatever stories they wanted to share. An incredible work of archive and collective memory. And also finding nourishment outside of writing, outside of reading. I think it took me 6 years to write this, so there's a lot of living that also had to happen. And in the book, there's a lot of attention paid to balance and this idea of like pairing sour and sweet, which is something that, in our community, that's very much how we eat. The very spicy and very sour always has sweet, and so just thinking about that in my own life, if the writing was feeling heavy or the research process was feeling heavy, where was the sweetness coming from? And in terms of language and translation, yes. So this book is written in English, which is the main language that I speak. At the same time, there is a lot of Gujarati in this book, and there's a lot of Swahili in this book. And very intentionally, I didn't differentiate between any of the languages. And that is a political choice in terms of, not drawing attention to foreignness of words that are not in English, but it's also very much a choice that comes out of the ways that my family and community speak, where it's very normal to be speaking in English and then to just drop in a word, and most often we don't know if the word that we're dropping in is in Swahili or in Gujarati, and that's because this language that our community speaks is very much a hybrid of those languages, and that language itself is a testament to our history. It's a testament to the places that we've migrated, and the ways that we've had to adapt, and the ways that we've had to move and change. And so it felt very important for me that I reflect that and honor that language in the book.
I'm really curious about how you're saying that like the relationships and the healing experience of like interviewing all of those people is like kind of the biggest gift that you're taking away from this, like beyond just the book itself. And so I'm curious if you could speak a little to like some of the most special relationships that have come up out of doing that work, whether it was through your interviews or perhaps through like the nonfiction reading, if you connected with those authors in person at all, or people reading your book and responding to it, like just some of those relationships that have come up from that experience.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, most importantly or most close to my heart is like my immediate family, and getting to have these conversations that we had never had before, and the ways that that is continuing today. I keep using the word opening, but it really does feel like that because, yes, I was researching and I was doing these Zoom calls and whatever, but that was for the purpose of the book. But these conversations that we're having, that's just for us, right? That's forever. And the fact that we get to keep having that, and that's growing over time, I think that is the biggest gift. And I think something else that has been really special is that so often in these Zoom calls there would be people, like I said, who were in their 80s, and then there would be people who were in my parents' generation, so in their 60s, and then often there would be people of my generation who would sit in on the calls to help with the laptop or whatever, and then to this day I have people texting me, people of my generation texting and saying, oh, we just, sat down and had this conversation at the kitchen table, and, my mom or grandma shared this story that I'd never heard before. And yeah, the ways that it's kind of been able to ripple out into other families and other spheres, that is also really special when I get to see that.
Maybe this is kind of a thought experiment, but I'm curious if in 5-10 years you're looking back at this book, like, do you have any thoughts on what might come up for you? Or the book is kind of a living document and like where it might go.
Yeah, I feel like I would have to think a lot. That is a thought experiment. I hope that the conversations continue. I'm talking about like opening and healing, and that doesn't begin with this book or with me, and it also doesn't end with this book. That's like long work, that's generational work, and so I don't know what 5 or 10 years down the line holds, but I hope that work is ongoing.
Sounds like it definitely will.
Do you see that in the context of having published this book in the aftermath of anti-Asian violence, becoming part of the public conversation in a way that maybe it wasn't if you had published it 20 years ago or 30 years ago or something? Do you think that there is more willingness to listen to these stories as a result of.
Yeah, I think one of the funny things about when you're writing a book and then publishing it is that you have no idea what moment it's going to come out into, right? I sent in the very final document over a year ago. The publishing deal happened 2 years ago. So really, like, you have no sense of what's to come. And I guess in terms of it coming, there are a lot of conversations happening now about, not only about anti-Asian violence, but also about solidarity and kind of cross-community, cross-racial solidarities and the possibilities in that. And so I do think that there is kind of this groundwork maybe for this book to be coming out in, but also that has always been here, like conversations about solidarity, about collective liberation, about Afro-Asian coalition building, like that is not new. In the book, there are examples of that in the 60s in Uganda. The fact that that's happening here in the US now in 2020, 2023 is amazing, but it's not new. Right? There's a lineage of that kind of resistance. And this book is just one way of looking back.
Other questions? Oh,
Hi, you said you had to set aside a book that you've been working on for 2 years in order to give this the attention it deserved, and I was wondering whether you felt any resistance to putting that aside after having probably invested so much in it for that long, or whether it felt kind of intuitive to keep going with this one.
Thank you. It was actually pretty easy for me to drop the other one. I think it was really hard. It was tough going, that one, and I was just figuring out how to write, and how to write something long form. And then this, I was also figuring out how to write something long form, but there was a feeling with this book of, there was a sense of progression. I could see where it was going. And I think partly because it's a historical novel, or because it's based in these real events in history, I also had these kind of markers. I knew that I needed 1972 in this book, and then I knew I needed 1947, and then eventually I knew I needed the 90s, and so it was kind of, there was this way that it felt propulsive to me as well, and like the structure was, or the plot in a way was sort of inbuilt, and so I was able to just kind of like go forward with it. That other novel project, I didn't really feel the need or the desire to pick it back up. I did eventually turn it into a short story, and that short story got picked up for publication from like a dream publication for me, and I was really excited and was kind of going back and forth on edits with that journal, and then they unagreed to publish it, which I didn't know could happen until it happened to me.
Because they folded. Wow.
No.
So many have.
Yeah, but that's not what it was.
Well, maybe they will.
No, I don't wish that on them. But so I really had to put that short story away and just kind of feel like, put it in a drawer. It's not for right now. And then maybe a couple years later, it got cannibalized into a flash fiction piece, which is the piece that came out with the Kenyon Review and Sydney O. Henry. So it found its final, truest form, which is like 1,000 words. It didn't need to be a novel.
Excellent. Can they get books signed? Do they? Okay. Oh, well, I mean, I think are we at time or, okay, so we're at time, except now you can get your book signed by the author, which is so exciting. Now I'm sorry, I get to be the first one.